In a mansion where silence was law, a millionaire discovers his son wasn't born to live in quiet, but was kept that way. When an employee dares to touch what no one ever questioned, a biological secret is revealed, and the truth explodes with the first word pronounced by the child. If you like stories like this, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comment saying where you're listening from. In the imposing Aldenbrook Mansion, located high in the Appalachian Mountains in Asheville, North Carolina, every detail exuded opulence and perfection. From the meticulously manicured gardens to the Italian marble hallways, nothing escaped the critical eye of Richard Aldenbrook, owner of one of the largest pharmaceutical networks in the United States. At 45 years old, Richard had built an empire based on his obstinate pursuit of excellence. His laboratories were a national benchmark in advanced research. His medicines exported to dozens of countries, and his fortune grew exponentially each year. However, not all the money in the world had managed to solve the greatest challenge of his life, the silence of Matthew, his 10-year-old son. Born with apparent severe hearing impairment, Matthew had never uttered a single word. His communication was limited to basic gestures and facial expressions. Richard, unable to accept limitations in any aspect of his life, turned his son's condition into a personal obsession. He consulted the best specialists in the country and abroad, invested millions in experimental treatments, and equipped the mansion with state-of-the-art technology to monitor any progress. All in vain. The family mansion, known locally as the Crystal Palace due to its enormous windows that reflected the mountain sun, had become a kind of high-tech clinic. An entire floor had been converted into a medical area, with sophisticated equipment and a permanent team that included speech therapists, otolaryngologists, and neurologists. Every 3 months, international specialists were brought in to evaluate Matthew, always with the same disheartening result: irreversible condition. Despite all this structure, what was missing in that environment was precisely the most essential thing: human warmth. Richard, immersed in his frustration, rarely showed affection for his son. Their encounters were almost always mediated by some professional, transforming moments that should have been family intimacy into clinical sessions. Matthew grew up isolated in his silent world, observing everything with his large brown eyes. Always alert, always curious. "Mr. Aldenbrook, we need to discuss the results of the latest tests," announced Dr. Philip Ashton, the chief neurologist who had been following the case for years. He was a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses and a polished demeanor that hid his immeasurable ambition. Sitting in Richard's private office, the two men examined brain scans on a state-of-the-art digital screen. As you can see, there's been no significant change since the last mapping. The American Neurological Institute continues to recommend maintaining the current protocol, with minimal adjustments to the experimental medication. Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, a nervous tic that had intensified in recent years. 6 years, Doctor. 6 years of continuous investment in your institute, and no concrete progress. Dr. Philip adjusted his tie, uncomfortable with the tone of the conversation. "Mr. Aldenbrook, I must remind you that Matthew's case is unique. What we are doing here is cutting-edge science. Every piece of data collected, every response of his organism to stimuli is invaluable for our research." "Research?" Richard repeated the word with bitterness. "I'm not interested in making my son a case study. I want results." The doctor opened a digital folder and showed an investment graph. "And we are close to them. The development of the new neurological compound your company is funding has shown promising results in preliminary tests. If we can get the patent—" "The patent," Richard interrupted. "We always come back to that, don't we?" The doctor smiled discreetly. The truth was that the American Neurological Institute, of which he was a co-founder, depended on the millions injected annually by Aldenbrook Pharmaceuticals. And the biggest argument for maintaining that flow of money was precisely Matthew's special condition. The conversation was interrupted by the intercom. The voice of the governess, Mrs. Janet, sounded tense. "Sir, the new caregiver has arrived, the one you approved to stay with young Matthew." Richard checked the platinum watch on his wrist. "Send her to wait in the blue room. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Meanwhile, at the imposing entrance of the mansion, Louisa Rivers waited nervously. At 28 years old, Her face bore marks of someone who knew suffering intimately. Her green eyes, however, maintained a determined sparkle that was striking at first glance. Trained in special education, with a specialization in communication for children with disabilities, Louisa had been selected after a rigorous process that lasted months. What her resume didn't mention, and what she had made a point of concealing in interviews, was her personal motivation for working with deaf children. Hector, her younger brother, had also been born with severe hearing impairment. For years, she had watched him struggle to communicate in a world that seemed unwilling to listen to him, until, after a series of poorly managed treatments, Hector developed neurological complications that left him permanently incapacitated. Now admitted to a specialized clinic, he depended entirely on care. "Miss, would you accompany me?" The governess's voice interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Janet, a 60-year-old woman with impeccable posture and an appraising gaze, led her through the mansion's sumptuous corridors. "Mr. Oldenbrook has very specific rules for anyone dealing with young Matthew," the governess explained as they walked. "Every interaction must be recorded. No unnecessary physical contact. No attempt at communication that has not been approved by the medical team." Louisa nodded, though inside she felt a tightening in her chest. She had worked in other wealthy family homes, but she had never seen so many restrictions on interacting with a child. "The boy. What's he like?" she asked, trying to get some more personal information. Mrs. Janet hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much she could reveal. "Matthew is different, quiet as one would expect, but observant. Very observant. Sometimes I have the impression that he understands everything that happens around him, even without hearing a word." They arrived at the Blue Room, an elegant environment decorated in shades of navy blue and silver. The walls displayed paintings by renowned American artists, and the furniture, though luxurious, had that air of never having been truly used. "Wait here, Mr. Oldenbrook will be here shortly." Left alone, Louisa walked to one of the large windows. Outside, the Asheville sky was exceptionally clear, revealing the beauty of the mountains surrounding the property. For an instant, she felt small before that grandiose scenery, the imposing mansion, the majestic nature, the incalculable fortune that sustained it all. Impressive, isn't it? The deep voice made Louisa turn quickly. Richard Oldenbrook had silently entered the room. Tall, elegantly dressed in a custom-made suit, he exuded that natural authority of those accustomed to giving orders and seeing them obeyed without question. "The view is truly magnificent, Mr. Oldenbrook," she replied, maintaining her composure. "I'm not just referring to the landscape, Miss Rivers. I'm talking about everything I've built here." He made a sweeping gesture. "Do you know why I chose this region for our main residence?" "I imagine for the climate or the tranquility," Louisa ventured. "For the isolation," Richard corrected. "Here I can guarantee the privacy that my son's treatment requires, away from curious eyes, from journalists, from uncomfortable questions. Matthew deserves dignity in his condition." Louisa noticed that he spoke of his son as if discussing a clinical case, not a child. "Your credentials are impressive," Richard continued, abruptly changing the subject, "particularly your work with alternative communication methods for children with multiple disabilities. That's what caught my attention." "Thank you," Louisa replied. "I believe every child has their own way of expressing themselves. We just need to find the right key." Richard studied her for a few seconds, as if evaluating not just her words but her entire demeanor. "You understand that this is not a common job, correct? You will be dealing with confidential information. Matthew's treatment includes experimental protocols developed by my laboratories. Absolute discretion is a fundamental requirement." "I understand perfectly, sir." "Excellent." Richard checked his watch again. "Dr. Phillip will instruct you on the medical procedures. Mrs. Janet will show you your quarters and the areas of the house you will have access to. As for Matthew—" He paused, and for the first time Louisa noticed a slight alteration in his impassive expression. "He has good days and bad days. Today isn't a particularly good day." Before she could elaborate, the door opened and Dr. Phillip entered, carrying a tablet. "Ah, this must be Miss Rivers," he said with a professional smile. "I was eager to meet you." As the men conversed, Louisa had the strange sensation of being watched. Discreetly, she looked at the half-open door and saw for a brief instant a pair of childlike eyes observing her with intensity. As soon as he noticed her gaze, the child disappeared. Matthew. In that fleeting moment of visual connection, Louisa felt something she couldn't rationally explain, a deep certainty that there was much more in that gaze than anyone in that mansion could imagine. Later, already settled in her room in the staff annex, Louisa opened her suitcase and carefully removed a small wooden box. Inside was a silver butterfly-shaped brooch, the last gift she had given Hector before his hospitalization. Her brother loved butterflies, saying they spoke to him through their movements. "I came for you, Hector," she whispered to herself, "and for that boy." As night fell over the mountains, the Aldenbrook mansion plunged into its customary silence. In his isolated room, protected by advanced monitoring systems, Matthew sat by the window observing the stars. His small hands drew patterns in the air as if trying to reach the sky. Elsewhere on the property, Richard Aldenbrook spoke in a low voice on the phone. "Yes, she started today. No, she doesn't seem to suspect anything. Of course, we thoroughly checked her background. I understand your concerns, but we need her for the next stage of the project. Yes, the patent should be out in the next few months. No one will ever know." Upon hanging up, he stared at Matthew's photo on his desk, a child with a serious expression, a distant gaze. For a moment, something akin to remorse crossed his face, but it quickly dissipated, replaced by the determined expression of someone with greater goals to achieve. What none of the adults in that house knew was that Matthew, even in his silence, understood much more than they imagined, and that Louisa's arrival was about to change everything, forever. 2 weeks had passed since Louisa arrived at the Aldenbrook mansion. During that period, she rigorously followed the established protocols for Matthew's treatment. She attended sessions with specialists, recorded every reaction of the boy, and maintained the professional distance required by Richard. But behind this apparent conformity, Louisa observed. She observed with eyes trained not only by academic knowledge, but by painful personal experience. Something in Matthew's behavior deeply intrigued her. Contrary to what she would expect from a child with congenital deafness, the boy showed inconsistent reactions to auditory stimuli. Sometimes, during music therapy sessions, part of the experimental protocol, Louisa noticed a slight movement of his head towards certain frequencies. At other times, she noticed how he flinched when the volume reached a certain level, as if feeling discomfort. On a particularly sunny morning, Louisa received authorization to take Matthew to the property's garden. It was a rare concession. Normally he remained confined to the internal areas, specially prepared for his treatments. 30 minutes, no more, warned Dr. Philip, consulting his tablet. And keep the monitoring device activated at all times. The device was a harmless-looking bracelet that Matthew wore constantly. Supposedly, it measured his vital signs and sent real-time data to the clinic servers. Louisa had noticed how the boy frequently scratched his wrist in that area, as if the object caused irritation. In the garden, sitting on a wooden bench surrounded by century-old araucaria trees, Louisa tried to establish a more significant connection with Matthew. Until then, their interactions had been rigidly controlled by the constant presence of a medical team member. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" she said, knowing he couldn't hear her but maintaining the habit of verbalizing her thoughts. To her surprise, Matthew looked directly at her when she spoke, as if he had caught something. Intrigued, Louisa took a small drawing pad and a box of colored pencils from her bag, materials she had brought hidden, as they were not on the list of approved items for interaction. She quickly drew a blue butterfly and showed it to Matthew. The boy observed the drawing with intensity, then looked up at the sky where, coincidentally, a real butterfly flew among the flowers. A smile, the first Louisa had seen on his face, illuminated his features. Encouraged, she drew more animals, a bird, a cat, a turtle. For each drawing, she created a simple gesture with her hands, a rudimentary form of communication she had developed years ago with her brother. To her delight, Matthew began to imitate her gestures. When she made the movement representing the butterfly, intertwined fingers opening like wings, he repeated it perfectly and then pointed to the sky again. "You're understanding me," Louisa whispered. Feeling a deep emotion. You really are? The moment was interrupted by the metallic voice coming from the device on Matthew's wrist. External exposure time exceeded. A return to residential unit. The smile disappeared from the boy's face. His shoulders visibly slumped, and he stood up with resignation, like a prisoner returning to his cell. Back inside the mansion, Louisa was approached by Mrs. Janet in the hallway. "Mr. Aldenbrook wants to see you in his office immediately." The tone was not encouraging. Louisa felt a tightening in her stomach. Had someone seen her unauthorized interaction with Matthew in the garden? Richard Aldenbrook was on the phone when she entered the office. With a gesture, he indicated that she should wait while he finished the call. "I'm aware of the deadlines, Ferdinand. The FDA won't create problems if we present the correct results. Yes, the investors will be present at next week's meeting. No one will mention the side effects at this stage. I need to hang up now." He put down the phone and stared at Louisa with a neutral expression. "Miss Rivers, I'm curious about your initial impressions of Matthew." The question was seemingly innocent, but Louisa perceived an underlying tension. "He's an extraordinary boy. Mr. Aldenbrook, much more perceptive than the medical reports indicate." Richard drummed his fingers on the mahogany desk. "Extraordinary. Yes, that's an accurate description." He paused calculatedly. "Dr. Phillip mentioned that you questioned some aspects of the treatment protocol, so that was it." Louisa had, in fact, asked the doctor some questions about the medication Matthew received daily, a complex mixture of compounds that, according to the doctor, helped stabilize his neurological condition. "Just trying to better understand how I can contribute to the treatment." "Sir?" Richard studied her for a moment before replying. "Your dedication is admirable. However, I need to remind you that you were hired to implement the alternative communication techniques approved by the medical team, not to question the treatment itself." His tone was polite but inflexible. "Matthew is not a common child with a common disability. His case is complex." "I understand," Louisa replied, maintaining her composure. "I apologize if I gave the wrong impression." Richard nodded, seemingly satisfied with the reply. "Excellent. By the way, we have an important meeting next week. The American Neurological Institute will present the advancements of the last quarter to our investors. Your presence will be necessary, as you are now part of the team accompanying Matthew." After the tense conversation, Louisa returned to her quarters with her mind buzzing. Something was not right in that situation. The inconsistencies in Matthew's behavior, the excessive medication, the constant monitoring, everything indicated that there was more at stake than the treatment of a child with hearing impairment. That night, defying all house rules, Louisa decided to investigate. She waited until everyone was asleep and silently slipped through the mansion's corridors. She knew the location of the medical office, a room adjacent to Matthew's bedroom, where Dr. Phillip kept treatment records. The door was locked, as she expected, but Louisa had come prepared. During years of caring for Hector, she had learned some practical tricks, including how to pick simple locks with a hairpin. She knew she was risking her job, perhaps even more, but her concern for Matthew outweighed any personal apprehension. Inside the office, she only turned on the small flashlight she had brought with her. The room contained filing cabinets, a medical workstation, and various monitoring equipment. On a computer screen, she could see Matthew sleeping, captured by security cameras. Louisa felt a chill. What kind of father monitors his son with this level of invasiveness? She went to the digital archive, where she knew the medical records were stored. Surprisingly, the system didn't require a password, perhaps because the office itself was already considered a secure environment. What she found in the files left her astonished. Matthew had not been born with hearing impairment. The first tests, conducted when he was only months old, indicated normal hearing. It was only after his first year that reports began to show progressive deterioration of hearing ability. Coincidentally, this period corresponded to the start of the experimental treatment with a compound developed by Aldenbrook Pharmaceuticals, codenamed Project Silence. Even more disturbing, Louisa found correspondence between Richard and the American Neurological Institute that referred to Matthew not as a patient, but as primary subject of the longitudinal study. A noise in the hallway made her heart race. Quickly, she closed the files and turned off the flashlight. Footsteps approached. She hid behind a large medical equipment cabinet, barely breathing. The door opened and Dr. Philip entered, turning on only a partial light. He seemed agitated, speaking softly on the phone. "Yes, the results are promising, but we need more time. The boy is developing resistance to the main component. No, Richard cannot know this now, not with the investors about to sign. I am adjusting the dosage to keep the symptoms controlled." Louisa covered her mouth to avoid making any noise. The doctor continued, "If we can get the patent before anyone discovers the side effects, we will be protected. Yes, the new batch will arrive tomorrow. We need to maintain the status quo until next week's meeting." After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, the doctor left, leaving Louisa stunned by what she had just heard. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, forming a disturbing picture. Matthew was not just a boy with a medical condition, he was a human guinea pig. His own father allowed him to be used in experiments to develop a drug that apparently had enough profit potential to justify such cruelty. And worse, from what she understood of the conversation, the treatment was causing real damage, not only maintaining his deafness, but possibly creating other health problems. Louisa felt tears streaming down her face. The situation was painfully familiar. Just like Hector, Matthew was a victim of greed disguised as science. The difference was that this time she could do something about it. The next morning, Louisa met Matthew for their scheduled session. The boy looked paler than usual, with pronounced dark circles under his eyes. When she thought no one was watching, she slipped him a small piece of paper with a drawing of a butterfly and a question mark. To her surprise, Matthew took the pencil she discreetly offered and drew something in response, an ear with sound waves reaching it, followed by a plus sign and a drop, which Louisa interpreted as representing the medication. Beside it, he drew a sad face. The message was clear, even coming from a 10-year-old child. He knew that something in the medication affected his hearing, and this deeply saddened him. "I'm going to help you," Louisa whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. But the boy looked directly into her eyes and nodded, as if he had understood perfectly. That afternoon, while organizing her materials after another session, Louisa was surprised by Mrs. Janet's presence in her room. "You received some mail." "Miss," the governess said, handing her an envelope. Her tone was neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a silent warning. After Mrs. Janet left, Louisa opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, there was only a card with a handwritten message. "Not everything in this house is as it seems. Some serve for money, others for fear. If you truly care about the boy, be careful who you trust. The truth about Matthew is in the underground laboratory. Access code 2705. There was no signature, but the handwriting seemed to be that of an elderly person. Mrs. Janet? Or perhaps one of the other older employees? Whoever it was, they were risking a lot by sending that message. Underground laboratory. Louisa had no knowledge of such a place on the property. But now, thinking about it, there was a basement area she had never accessed, a door with electronic control near the medical wing. The anonymous correspondence only confirmed her suspicions. Something much bigger was happening in that mansion. Something that involved not only Matthew, but a network of interests that apparently was worth millions. That night, lying in her bed, Louisa reflected on her next steps. She needed to find concrete evidence before any drastic action, and above all, she needed to ensure Matthew's safety. Her phone vibrated, a text message from the clinic where Hector was admitted. His condition had worsened again. The doctors recommended she visit as soon as possible. Louisa pressed the phone against her chest, feeling the weight of her responsibilities. Hector needed her. Matthew too. And now she knew that time was running out for both of them. "I won't fail this time," she promised in a low voice. "For you, Hector, and for you, Matthew." On the other side of the mansion, Richard Aldenbrook examined a confidential report. Aldenbrook Pharmaceuticals shares had risen 15% with just the preliminary announcement of the new drug. If the patent was approved, his fortune would double overnight. The price of this success, however, could not be mentioned in shareholder meetings, years of silent suffering of his only son. For a moment, he looked at Matthew's photograph on his desk, the same one he had kept there since the boy was a baby. There was something accusing in those childlike eyes, something that made him look away. It's for the greater good, he justified to himself, repeating the mantra Dr. Philip always used. The medicine we are developing will help thousands of people. But not even he seemed to believe those words anymore. In his room, isolated and under constant surveillance, Matthew sat in the dark. His small hands repeatedly formed the gesture Louisa had taught him, that of the butterfly setting itself free. In his mind there wasn't just silence, there was a growing understanding, an awareness that his caregivers would never suspect. And, more importantly, for the first time in his life, there was hope. The meeting with the investors was scheduled for 2 days later. The Aldenbrook mansion buzzed with preparations, transforming into a stage where every detail was carefully orchestrated to impress visitors. Extra staff had been hired to ensure everything was impeccable, from the gardens to the halls where the presentations would take place. For Louisa, this extraordinary activity represented a unique opportunity. With so many people circulating on the property, surveillance on her and Matthew would naturally decrease. It was the perfect time to investigate the mysterious underground laboratory. That morning, during the scheduled session with Matthew, Louisa noticed something alarming. The boy looked even paler than in previous days, with purple bruises on his arms, classic signs of some drug reaction. "I don't like what I'm seeing," murmured Dr. Philip, examining Matthew's latest blood tests on his tablet. "The levels are unstable. Is this normal?" Louisa asked, trying to maintain a casual tone as her heart raced. The doctor gave her an appraising look. "These are expected side effects for the current stage of treatment," he replied dryly. "Nothing to worry about." But there was concern in his eyes, contradicting his words. After making some adjustments to the intravenous medication Matthew received every morning, the doctor hastily withdrew, leaving orders for the boy to remain at rest for the rest of the day. As soon as they were alone, Matthew took Louisa's hand and pressed it against his ear, making an expression of pain. Then, with discreet movements, he drew in the air the symbol they had created to represent help. "Hold on," Louisa whispered. "Tonight I'm going to find out what they're doing to you." To her surprise, Matthew responded by quickly drawing on a piece of paper. The drawing showed what appeared to be a staircase and a door, with a symbol resembling a crescent moon. "You know where the lab is?" she asked, impressed. The boy nodded, pointing downwards and then making a circular motion with his finger, indicating something below them, accessible by an alternative path. "Can you show me?" Matthew hesitated, looking at the security camera in the corner of the room. Then he drew a clock indicating midnight and made the gesture they had created for meeting. Louisa understood the message. At midnight, somehow, Matthew planned to show her the way to the lab. The idea that a 10-year-old boy, supposedly deaf and isolated, had such knowledge about the property was astonishing. Clearly there was much more to Matthew than anyone in that mansion suspected. The rest of the day passed with growing tension. During dinner served in the staff wing, Louisa noticed strange glances from some colleagues. Were they suspecting her investigations, or was it just the general climate of apprehension preceding the important meeting? Mrs. Janet, particularly, seemed to observe her with disturbing intensity. When everyone had left and Louisa was alone washing her cup, the governess approached silently. "You need to be careful, miss," whispered the older woman, pretending to organize some utensils. "The walls have ears in this house." "Was it you who sent me the note?" Louisa asked directly, keeping her voice low. Mrs. Janet didn't answer directly, but her eyes said everything. "I've worked for the Aldenbrooks for 15 years. I've seen things I shouldn't have seen." She paused, checking if they were truly alone. "The boy wasn't born this way, you know. He was a normal, vibrant child, until they started with the treatments." A shiver ran down Louisa's spine. "Why tell me this now?" Because I saw how you look at him. With the same look you'd have for your own child." Mrs. Janet sighed deeply. "And because I can no longer bear to be an accomplice. Not all the money in the world is worth that child's suffering." "What exactly happens in the lab?" Louisa asked, seizing the rare moment of openness. "Experiments. Mr. Aldenbrook and his team are developing a revolutionary drug, something that could treat severe neurological conditions. The problem is they needed a test subject from the early stages." The governess's voice trembled slightly. "His own son became that subject." "That's monstrous," Louisa murmured, feeling nauseous. It's business, Mrs. Janet corrected bitterly. For men like Richard Aldenbrook, everything in life has a price and a purpose, even a son. Before they could continue their conversation, they heard footsteps approaching. Immediately, both returned to their previous activities, maintaining neutral expressions when another employee entered the kitchen. As the night progressed, Louisa mentally prepared for what was to come. At midnight, as agreed, she waited in her room, uncertain how Matthew planned to meet her. Children were not allowed to circulate through the mansion at night, especially Matthew, whose room was constantly monitored. To her surprise, exactly at midnight, her cell phone vibrated. It was a text message from an unknown number, containing only a butterfly emoji, the symbol she had taught Matthew. How could a 10-year-old boy, supposedly isolated, have access to a phone? And how had he gotten her number? Intrigued and increasingly impressed by Matthew's resourcefulness, Louisa followed the instructions that came next: exit through the back, go around the winter garden, and find a small service door near the greenhouse. The night was surprisingly cold for Asheville standards, with a low fog covering the gardens like a ghostly shroud. Using her phone's flashlight only when absolutely necessary, Louisa followed the indicated path, alert for any movement or sound. At the specified location, she found not Matthew, but a small tablet fixed to the wall, with a butterfly image on the screen. Upon touching it, the device showed a simplified map of the property, with a path marked in red. Incredible, she murmured to herself, following the directions. The route led her through areas of the property she was completely unfamiliar with: service passages, secondary corridors, even a narrow staircase that descended to what appeared to be an old basement. At the end of the staircase, a modern metal door contrasted with the rustic environment. Next to the control panel, someone had stuck a small sticker with a hand-drawn butterfly. Below it, in childlike handwriting, was written 2705. Louisa typed the code, holding her breath. The door slid silently open, revealing a corridor lit by embedded LED lights in the ceiling. It was like entering another world, an aseptic and ultra-modern environment, completely different from the rest of the mansion. Following the corridor, she reached another door, this one with biometric identification. She stopped, frustrated. There was no way to get past that kind of security. Almost as if anticipating this obstacle, the tablet in her hands vibrated again. The screen showed a simple animation, someone pressing a panel next to the door. Louisa examined the wall and found semi-hidden a small switch. Upon pressing it, a side passage opened, clearly an emergency entrance, probably unknown even to most employees. "How do you know all this, Matthew?" she asked aloud, though she knew the boy wasn't there to answer. The laboratory was impressive in its sophistication. State-of-the-art equipment, advanced computerized systems, and various carefully organized workstations. On an entire wall, screens displayed complex data: graphs, neurological readings, molecular sequencing. Louisa approached a central station where several documents were scattered. Technical reports, test results, and her heart almost stopped when she saw sequential photographs of Matthew over the years, each accompanied by detailed medical data. The first photo showed a smiling baby with lively and expressive eyes. The caption indicated, "Subject M01 6 months, audiometry normal, neural response excellent." The subsequent photos documented a gradual change, the smile diminishing, the gaze becoming more distant. At 2 years old, subject M01, start of protocol alpha, first application of compound NR27, initial reaction as expected. At 4 years old, progressive decrease in auditory function, introverted behavior, expansion of protocol for neuroplastic effects testing. At 7 years old, profound deafness achieved, start of phase 2, compounds NR42 and NR43 introduced, objective, controlled reversibility. Louisa felt tears streaming down her face as she read those clinical reports that documented with scientific coldness the deliberate destruction of a child's health. Her hands trembling, she photographed each document with her cell phone. In a locked drawer, which she managed to open, using techniques she had learned in her previous investigation, she found something even more disturbing: the complete business plan for the launch of NeuroClear, the drug that Aldenbrook Pharmaceuticals planned to patent. The document described, in clear terms, how the drug worked, first causing a specific type of hearing loss, and then, with the administration of a second compound, progressively reversing the damage, thus creating a lucrative cure for a problem that the initial drug itself had caused. "My God," Louisa whispered, horrified. They created the disease to sell the cure. Even more shocking was a section titled Projected Profitability, which calculated the expected profits, billions of dollars, based on a marketing strategy that would position NeuroClear as the first true cure for certain types of neurological deafness. As she frantically photographed all the documents she found, Louisa heard a sound that chilled her blood. The main laboratory door was being unlocked. Quickly, she hid behind a large piece of equipment, praying not to be discovered. Dr. Philip entered, accompanied by a woman Louisa had never seen, a scientist, judging by the lab coat she was wearing. "The results are alarming." "Doctor," the woman said, consulting data on a tablet, "toxicity levels in the last test exceeded all safety parameters. If we continue with the current dosage, we risk permanent damage to the central nervous system." "We have no choice," replied Dr. Philip, visibly tense. "The investor meeting is the day after tomorrow. If we don't present consistent results, we could lose all funding. You know how much we've already invested in this project." "We are talking about a child's life," argued the scientist, her voice betraying indignation. "Richard's own son. A child who represents the future of neurological medicine," the doctor retorted coldly. "The data we collect with Matthew will allow us to help thousands of other children in the future." "If he survives the process," murmured the scientist, but low enough for Dr. Philip to pretend not to hear. "Prepare a new battery of tests for early tomorrow," he ordered. "I want to evaluate the brain's response to controlled sound stimuli and increase the dosage of NR43 by 5%. "That's too dangerous," protested the scientist. "It's a direct order from Richard," the doctor cut in. "He's willing to take the risk." After a few minutes reviewing other data, both left the laboratory, leaving Louisa stunned by what she had just heard. The situation was even worse than she imagined. They weren't just using Matthew as a guinea pig. They were putting his life in imminent danger. With a heavy heart and a swirling mind, Louisa left the laboratory the same way she had entered. Upon returning to her room, she found something surprising on her bed. A small butterfly-shaped origami made with blue tissue paper. Inside, a message written in childlike handwriting. "You've seen the truth now. Help me fly." How had Matthew managed to enter her room undetected? How did he know she had gone to the laboratory? The boy's abilities seemed to defy everything she had been told about him. That night, Louisa couldn't sleep. The images of the laboratory, the shocking documents, the conversation between Dr. Philip and the scientist, everything swirled in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. One thing was clear. She needed to act quickly. Matthew's life literally depended on it. The next morning, during breakfast, Louisa was approached by Richard Aldenbrook, something extremely unusual, as the businessman rarely interacted with employees outside of formal meetings. "Miss Rivers, I'd like you to prepare Matthew for a special procedure this afternoon," he said, with that superficial cordiality that characterized his interactions. "Dr. Philip will perform some important tests before tomorrow's presentation." "Any specific procedure, sir?" Louisa asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Just make sure he's calm." Richard's gaze was penetrating, as if trying to see beyond her professional facade. "Dr. Philip mentioned that you've been developing an interesting communication system." "Just basic techniques to facilitate interaction," Louisa replied, trying to minimize her achievements with Matthew. Richard nodded. But there was something in his expression that made her uncomfortable, a mixture of suspicion and calculation. "You know, Miss Rivers, I've always thoroughly investigated everyone who works directly with my son." He paused significantly. "Your brother Hector also suffers from a neurological condition, doesn't he? A pity what happened to him after those experimental treatments at the St. Jude Institute." Louisa's blood ran cold. He knew. He knew about Hector, about her personal motivation, perhaps even about her recent investigations. "Doctors do what they can, sir," she replied cautiously. "Treatments don't always have the expected outcome." Indeed. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's why our work here is so important. Imagine a world where conditions like your brother's can be completely reversed. That's what Project Silence promises. The explicit mention of the secret project's name was like a warning sign. Richard was sending a clear message. He knew she had discovered something. And he was warning her not to interfere. It would truly be revolutionary, Louisa agreed, maintaining her composure. Revolutionary and extremely lucrative, Richard completed with surprising frankness. What many don't understand is that without profit, there's no medical progress. We need billions to develop life-saving treatments. It's a cold but necessary calculation. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Philip, who seemed agitated. Richard, we need to review the slides for tomorrow. The Japanese investors just confirmed their presence. With a final nod to Louisa, Richard walked away, leaving her with an even greater sense of urgency. The net was closing in. Upon meeting Matthew for the morning session, Louisa was shocked by his appearance. The boy was visibly debilitated, with deep dark circles under his eyes and occasional tremors in his hands. When the medical assistants were distracted, he quickly wrote a message for her. Tonight, the bad doctor is going to give me the big injection. After that, it will be too late. Louisa felt her heart clench. The big injection likely referred to the increased dosage she had heard Dr. Philip mention in the laboratory, the one the scientist considered too dangerous. I won't let that happen, she promised silently, squeezing Matthew's hand. The boy looked deeply into her eyes and formed with his lips, without emitting a sound but perfectly clearly, a word he shouldn't have known. Considering his supposed condition, I trust. In that moment, Louisa made her decision. She couldn't wait another day, not even a few more hours. The special procedure mentioned by Richard was scheduled for that afternoon. She needed to act before then. While Matthew was taken for his routine morning examinations, Louisa headed to the mansion's communications room. As part of the core team, she had access to the internal system for sending reports. Using this access, she sent a package of encrypted files to her personal email, all the photos and documents she had collected the previous night. Then she made 3 quick calls, one to an investigative journalist she had met during Hector's treatment, another to the FDA, and the third to her former college professor, now a respected lawyer specializing in bioethics. The plan was imperfect, risky, and would likely result in the end of her career. But when she weighed that against Matthew's life, there was truly no choice to be made. As she walked down the corridor towards the medical wing, Louisa felt a strange calm, the tranquility of someone who had finally found her purpose. Years ago, she hadn't been able to save Hector from the clutches of experimental and greedy medicine. This time it would be different. Matthew deserved more than being a statistic in a financial report. He deserved more than being Subject M01 in a cruel experiment. He deserved what every child deserves, a chance to simply be a child. With that thought firmly in mind, Louisa pushed open the door to the room where Matthew awaited his next procedure. What happened next would forever change not only the boy's life, but that of everyone in that mansion. Upon entering the room where Matthew was waiting, Louisa found not only the boy but also Dr. Philip, who was arranging a tray with various medical instruments and vials of medication. Miss Rivers, you've arrived at the right time, said the doctor, without looking up from his work. I'm about to start an important procedure, and I'll need you to keep Matthew calm. Louisa observed the vials on the tray. She recognized the label of one of them from the photographs she had taken in the laboratory, NR43. The compound the scientist had warned was dangerous in high doses. What exactly will this procedure do? She asked, trying to sound merely professionally curious. Dr. Philip hesitated for a moment, as if assessing how much he should reveal. It's an advanced neurological treatment that will help stabilize Matthew's condition before tomorrow's demonstration, he finally replied. The investors need to see consistent results. Consistent results, Louisa repeated, unable to completely hide her indignation. And have the risks of this procedure been properly evaluated? The doctor stared at her with growing irritation. Miss Rivers, your job here is to implement communication techniques, not to question medical procedures that are far beyond your understanding. Matthew, sitting on the gurney, observed the interaction with attentive eyes. Although his face remained impassive, his fingers discreetly formed the gesture they had created for danger. "Dr. Philip, with all due respect," said Louisa, buying time while considering her options, "I've noticed some worrying symptoms in Matthew in recent days. Tremors, extreme fatigue, skin reactions. As a specialized educator, I have a professional obligation to report such observations. Your observations have already been duly recorded," the doctor replied coldly. "Now if you could help Matthew lie down." At that critical moment, the door opened and Richard Oldenbrook entered, followed by the scientist Louisa had seen in the laboratory the previous night. "How are we progressing, Philip?" Richard asked, his gaze quickly sweeping the room before settling on his son. "We are about to begin, sir," replied the doctor, his tone immediately more respectful. "The new protocol should produce significant results for tomorrow's presentation." The scientist, whose badge identified her as Dr. Claudia Mason, approached the medication tray and frowned upon seeing the prepared dosage. "Dr. Philip, this concentration exceeds what we discussed by 20%, she said in a low but firm voice. "It's too risky." "Those were the parameters we agreed on this morning," the doctor replied, visibly irritated by the interruption. "No, they were not," insisted Dr. Claudia, turning to Richard. "Mr. Oldenbrook, I need to formally register my objection to this procedure. Preliminary tests indicate a high risk of permanent neurological damage with this dosage." Richard seemed uncomfortable with the public confrontation, especially in Louisa's presence. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he suggested, indicating the door. It was at that moment that Louisa made her decision. She could no longer just observe. "Mr. Oldenbrook," she said, taking a step forward, "before you proceed, I believe you should know a few things about your son's current condition." The businessman stared at her with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "What did you say?" "Matthew is not naturally deaf," Louisa stated clearly. "He has been deliberately kept in that condition through the experimental compounds that Dr. Philip has administered for years." A tense silence dominated the room. Dr. Philip visibly paled. "That's absurd," he finally managed to say. "You clearly don't understand the medical complexity of the case." "I understand enough," Louisa replied, keeping her voice firm as she addressed Richard directly. "Mr. Oldenbrook, I saw the documents in the underground laboratory. I saw the reports that show Matthew was born with normal hearing. I saw the business plan for NeuroClear, a drug that first causes deafness and then cures it, generating billions in profits." Richard remained impassive, but a muscle pulsed in his temple, the only visible sign of disturbance. "That is an extremely serious accusation, Miss Rivers," he finally said. "Based on what exactly?" "On documentary evidence that has already been sent to the FDA, the Department of Justice, and investigative journalists," Louisa replied, playing her riskiest card. It was partially a bluff. The evidence had been sent, but the authorities had not yet confirmed receipt. Dr. Philip took a threatening step forward. "You invaded a restricted area? That's a crime." "Crime?" Louisa repeated, feeling a courage she didn't know she possessed. "And what is it to use a child as a human guinea pig in unauthorized experiments for a decade?" "What would we call that, Doctor?" Richard raised his hand, silencing the doctor, who seemed about to explode. "Miss Rivers, I suggest you choose your words carefully. You are making accusations against one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country, with an army of lawyers at its disposal. And you are threatening the person who can testify about years of abuse against your own son," Louisa retorted. Then, turning to Dr. Claudia, she asked, "Doctor, did you know about this from the beginning?" The scientist seemed deeply uncomfortable. She looked at Richard, then at Matthew, and finally replied, "No, I was only hired 6 months ago for the final phase of the project. When I realized the real nature of the experiments," her voice trailed off, "I tried to warn about the ethical risks, but no one listened to you," Louisa completed, "just as no one listened to Matthew all these years. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Matthew, who had been observing everything with absolute attention, got off the gurney and walked to stand between Louisa and his father. With deliberate movements, he removed the monitoring device from his wrist and threw it on the floor." "Matthew!" exclaimed Dr. Philip, alarmed. "That's vital for your treatment." The boy ignored the doctor. Instead, he made a series of gestures to Louisa, the simplified sign language they had developed together. His movements were fluid and precise, telling a story that only Louisa could fully comprehend. "What is he saying?" Richard asked, his voice betraying for the first time something beyond his usual coldness. Louisa translated, keeping her eyes fixed on Matthew. "He says he can hear." "Not perfectly, but he can. He says he learned to pretend he couldn't hear anything because he noticed it made the doctors happy." She paused, checking the next gestures. "He says he knows what you're doing to him. That he found a way to access the computers when no one was looking and learned about the project. He understands everything." The expression of shock on Richard's face was indescribable. He looked at his son as if seeing him for the first time. "That's impossible," murmured Dr. Philip. "Even with partial hearing, he wouldn't be able to understand." "You underestimated his intelligence," Louisa said, "just as you underestimated his resilience." Matthew continued signing, now with more emotional gestures. "He says," Louisa translated, her voice slightly choked, "that he knows. About the other medications, the ones injected at night when he's sleeping, the ones that cause ear pain and make his head feel confused. He says he pretended to swallow the medicines many times, but actually hid them." Richard took a hesitant step towards his son. "Matthew, The boy recoiled, positioning himself closer to Louisa. His gestures became more intense, almost furious. "He asks why," Louisa said, letting tears flow freely now. "Why his own father allowed him to suffer for all these years. He wants to know if any medicine is worth more than a father's love." The question hung in the air like an unrefutable accusation. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of engines, cars arriving at the property. "It seems we have early visitors," Louisa observed. "Perhaps it's the investors, or perhaps it's the representatives from the FDA and the Department of Justice whom I contacted this morning." Dr. Philip looked at Richard in panic. "We need to contain this immediately. If the press finds out—" "Silence," Richard ordered, his voice trembling in a way no one had ever witnessed. He approached Matthew again, this time stopping at a respectful distance. "Can my son really hear me? Can he understand what I'm saying?" Say. Response: Matthew did something that left everyone in the room in absolute shock. He opened his mouth and, with a voice hoarse from disuse but clearly audible, uttered a single word. "Father." The sound of that voice, the first word Richard had heard from his son in 10 years, had a devastating effect. The powerful businessman staggered as if physically struck, needing to lean on the gurney to keep from falling. How is this possible?" he murmured, looking at Dr. Philip. The doctor seemed equally stunned. "It shouldn't be. The auditory tests always showed." "The tests you falsified?" Louisa interrupted. "The results you manipulated to continue? Receiving funding for your research?" In the hallway, voices and footsteps could be heard approaching. The situation was about to spiral completely out of control. It was then that Richard Oldenbrook did something no one could have predicted. He knelt before his son, bringing himself to his level. "Matthew," he said, his voice completely transformed. "Son, can you forgive me?" The boy looked long at his father, then at Louisa as if seeking guidance. "Whatever your decision," she said softly, "I will be by your side." Matthew turned back to face his father. Then, with visible effort, he uttered another word. "Why?" The simplicity of that question contained all the complexity of the trauma experienced. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, as if searching for an answer within himself. "Because I was blind," he finally said. "Blind by ambition, by success, by a distorted view of what it meant to care for you. I thought I was building a legacy, but I was destroying what truly mattered." The door opened abruptly. Mrs. Janet entered, followed by 2 men in suits who identified themselves as FBI agents. Behind them, a team from the FDA and a man Louisa recognized as the journalist she had contacted. "Richard Oldenbrook?" asked one of the agents. "We have a warrant for inspection of the facilities and seizure of documents related to unauthorized medical research. We request your cooperation." Before the situation escalated into a confrontation, Richard made a surprising gesture. He stood up and said with a clear voice, "I will cooperate fully with the authorities. and I wish to officially record that Miss Louisa Rivers acted with exemplary integrity in reporting practices that, I now recognize, were deeply unethical." Dr. Philip looked at him in absolute shock. "Richard, you can't be serious, everything we built." "Enough, Philip," Richard cut in. "It's over. Look at my son. Really, look at him. What we did has no justification." The agents began formal procedures, requesting access to the underground laboratory and digital files. Dr. Claudia readily offered to help, revealing that she had kept parallel records of her ethical concerns as a personal safeguard. As the mansion transformed into the scene of a complex police operation, Louisa remained by Matthew's side, shielding him from the escalating chaos. They found refuge in the library, where the boy, for the first time in years, could simply be a child without being connected to monitors or subjected to constant tests. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Matthew nodded, his eyes revealing a complex mixture of emotions: relief, fear, hope, confusion. Speaking difficult, he managed to say, touching his own throat, but hearing, yes. "It will get better with time and proper therapy," Louisa assured him. "The important thing is that now you can be yourself, without pain-causing medications, without experiments." "You knew?" he asked with effort, forming the words slowly. "I suspected something was wrong from the beginning," Louisa replied honestly, "but I didn't imagine the extent, not until I saw those files." Matthew made the gesture they had created for brother, followed by a question mark. "Yes," Louisa confirmed with a sad smile. "My brother Hector was also a victim of unethical medical experiments. That's why I recognized the signs. That's why I needed to help you." The library door opened, and Richard entered hesitantly. He seemed to have aged a decade in just a few hours, his face marked by the weight of the consequences of his choices. "May I speak with you?" he asked, an unprecedented humility in his voice. Louisa looked at Matthew, leaving the decision to him. The boy nodded, though he moved slightly closer to her. "The agents are sealing the laboratory," Richard informed, sitting at a respectful distance. "I will face serious charges, as is fair, but my concern now is for you, Matthew." For the first time, he looked directly at his son without the clinical lens that had always dominated his perception. "There will be a long legal process," he continued, "and I understand if you don't want to see me during this period, or even afterwards. But I want you to know that, regardless of what happens to me, all the necessary resources for your recovery and well-being will be guaranteed." He turned to Louisa. "Miss Rivers, I understand I have no right to ask for anything, but Matthew trusts you. He needs someone who truly cares, someone who sees him as a person, not a medical condition." He paused, visibly emotional. "Would there be any possibility of you remaining involved in his care under whatever terms you deem appropriate?" Before Louisa could answer, Matthew intervened, surprising them both. With a combination of broken words and gestures, he managed to communicate. "Louisa, stay, please." "Of course I'll stay," she replied, moved. "For as long as you need." Richard observed the interaction with a mixture of gratitude and deep regret. "There's something else," he said hesitantly. "Something about your brother, Miss Rivers." Louisa's heart raced. "What about Hector?" "The St. Jude Institute, where he was treated, is partially funded by Aldenbrook Pharmaceuticals." Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "I reviewed the records this morning. The same experimental compounds used on Matthew were tested there in early stages." Louisa felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Are you saying my brother?" "He was a victim of the same project, yes," Richard gravely confirmed, "and I promise by my son's life that I will use every resource at my disposal to develop a genuine treatment that can help him, not for profit or patents, but as the beginning of a reparation that will never be complete." That afternoon, as authorities moved through the mansion collecting evidence, a silent transformation was occurring. The imposing structure that had been designed to isolate and control began to open up. Windows that had remained closed for years were thrown wide open, allowing the fresh mountain air to circulate freely. 3 months later, the Aldenbrook mansion had completely transformed. Converted into a rehabilitation center for children with neurological disabilities, especially those affected by experimental treatments, the place that had once been a symbol of isolation now harbored hope. Richard Aldenbrook, after confessing all details of the scheme and collaborating extensively with investigations, was serving house arrest while awaiting trial. As part of a judicial agreement, he had transferred most of his fortune to an independent foundation dedicated to repairing the damages caused by his companies. Dr. Philip faced more severe charges, having been identified as the main architect of the experiment's cruelest aspects. Dr. Claudia, in turn, became a key witness for the Department of Justice, helping to dismantle a network of unethical research that extended across various institutes in the country. As for Matthew, his recovery was a daily process of small victories. With the discontinuation of experimental medications, his hearing ability had considerably improved, although some damage remained irreversible. His speech, initially limited to single words, gradually developed with the help of dedicated speech therapists. Louisa had taken over the direction of the new center, implementing innovative therapeutic methods based on her experience with Matthew. Under her care, the facility welcomed not only children with special needs, but also their families, offering comprehensive support and ongoing education. On a sunny spring morning, Louisa received news that made her run to find Matthew in the garden, where he cultivated a flower bed that attracted butterflies. "Matthew, I have wonderful news." The boy, now with longer hair and a healthier face, smiled upon seeing her. His eyes, once dulled by constant medication, now shone with vividness. "Good news?" he asked, his speech still slow but much clearer than months ago. "Hector responded to the new treatment," exclaimed Louisa, barely containing her emotion. "The doctors are optimistic. They think he might be able to leave the clinic in a few weeks." "Is he coming to live here?" Matthew asked hopefully. "If you don't mind sharing your butterfly garden," Louisa smiled. "Many butterflies." "For everyone," replied the boy, making the gesture they had created for family. Not far from there, Richard observed the scene from his office window, now converted into an administrative room. Although restricted to the property by court order, he had actively involved himself in the transformation of the place, using his managerial knowledge to ensure the efficient functioning of the center. His relationship with Matthew progressed slowly, marked by weekly sessions with a family therapist. The path to reconciliation would be long, perhaps a lifelong endeavor, but every small moment of genuine connection was valued as the treasure it truly represented. When Matthew spotted his father at the window, he did something that would have been unthinkable months before. He waved, a simple gesture but laden with possibilities. Richard waved back, his eyes watering. That night, as Louisa helped Matthew prepare for bed, now in a colorful and cozy room, without cameras or monitors, the boy asked a question that caught her by surprise. "Why do some people can't hear without hearing aids?" "Well, there are different types of deafness," Louisa explained patiently. "Some people are born unable to hear. Others lose their hearing due to illness or accidents. Each case is unique." Matthew thought for a moment, processing the information. "And the people who can hear but don't listen?" The depth of the question left her momentarily speechless. For a child who had lived in silence for so long, Matthew had developed remarkable wisdom. "Those are the hardest to help," she finally replied, "because the problem isn't in their ears but in their hearts." "Like my father?" Matthew asked softly. "Yes," Louisa confirmed, "but your father is learning to listen now. Sometimes people need a big scare to start hearing what truly matters." "Like the butterfly," Matthew said, referring to the metaphor they frequently used in their conversations. "First the cocoon, then the transformation." Louisa smiled, hers always impressed with his perception. "Exactly like the butterfly." When Matthew finally fell asleep, Louisa went to the balcony that now served as her informal office. From there she could contemplate the Asheville Mountains, majestic under the starry sky. The cold, clean air carried promises of a future that, just a few months ago, would have seemed impossible. Her phone vibrated with a message from Richard. "Doctors confirmed. The reversal of effects in Hector is real. It's not temporary. It worked." Tears of relief streamed down her face as she typed her reply, "Thank you for not giving up on him." The reply came almost immediately. "Thank you for not giving up on Matthew. And on me." The mansion that had once been a place of silent suffering now echoed with sounds of hope, children's voices, therapists' laughter, even music, which Matthew had discovered he deeply loved. The imposed silence had given way to a symphony of possibilities. The next morning, a small ceremony would officially mark the inauguration of the Butterfly Rehabilitation Center, a name chosen by Matthew himself. Journalists, medical authorities, and patient families would be present to witness the extraordinary transformation of the place. And for the first time, Matthew would speak in public, reading a short speech he had written himself with Louisa's help. A speech about second chances, about listening with the heart, about transformations that seemed impossible until they happened. As she finalized preparations for the event, Louisa reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her there. What had begun as a personal mission of redemption for what she couldn't do for Hector had become something much larger, a movement that was already beginning to spark changes in legislation regarding medical research and the rights of vulnerable patients. Richard, despite all his flaws, was using his remaining influence to ensure that other children would not suffer like Matthew. Eldenbrook Pharmaceuticals, under new management, had implemented a rigorous ethics and transparency committee, transforming itself into an example of responsible conduct after the scandal. And Matthew blossomed each day, discovering his voice not only in the literal sense, but also as an advocate for the rights of other children in similar situations. His testimony, recorded and presented to Congress, had been fundamental for the approval of a new law that bore his name, Matthew's Law, which established unprecedented protections for minors involved in clinical research. On the balcony, under the starry Asheville sky, Louisa opened the small diary where she recorded Matthew's progress. On that day's page, she simply wrote, "Today he sang for the first time." Some transformations could not be adequately described in medical reports or quantified in progress charts. Some victories simply needed to be celebrated for the miracle they represented. The mansion that had been built to isolate now opened to the world, just like Matthew. The forced silence had given way to a symphony of possibilities. And in the butterfly garden, the metamorphosis continued, one day at a time.